Welcome back, my friends, to Faces of History, the place where we stand eye to eye with the builders and breakers of nations, the dreamers and the doomed, the heroes and the haunted. Tonight, we travel back to the most divided ground in American memory, the blood-soaked soil of the Civil War. And we stand face to face with a man whose name still sparks debate, tastes whose choices tore at the fragile seams of a young republic. His name? Jefferson Phineas Davis, soldier, senator, slaveholder, and president of the Confederate States of America. How does a boy born on the edge of the American frontier become the leader of a rebellion that cost more American lives than any war before or since? What did he believe? What broke him? And what legacy did he leave behind? Pour yourself something strong. Sit back and let's step into the complicated life of a man who stood at the crossroads of liberty and bondage, union and disunion, and chose the losing side of history. Before the cannon fire and the marble statues, before the presidency of a doomed rebellion, Jefferson Phineas Davis was just a boy born on the ragged edge of America's promise and its contradictions. He came into this world on June 3rd, 1808, in a log cabin in Christian County, Kentucky, frontier country in every sense of the word. The land was rough, the trees thick, the rivers wild. His father, Samuel Emory Davis, was a veteran of the American Revolution, a man who had fought to throw off the British yoke, who had helped carve a new nation out of rebellion and raw hope. Jefferson was the 10th and youngest child in a family that carried the old Scotch-Irish stubbornness deep in its bones. His mother, Jane Cook Davis, was said to be fiercely devoted, and she named him Phineas because she believed he would be her last child. But even in his cradle, there were omens of conflict and contradiction. When Jefferson was 2, the Davis family packed up their few belongings and trekked south, deeper into what was then the Mississippi Territory. They settled near Woodville, a place that felt more like a clearing in the forest than a town. The land was cheap, the soil rich for cotton, and like so many families drawn southward, the Davises would come to depend on enslaved labor to turn wild fields into wealth. Young Jefferson's earliest memories were not of grand halls or marble columns, but of muddy roads, log cabins, and the endless green of the southern frontier. He learned to ride a horse before he could read fluently. He knew the hush of the swamp at dawn, the crackle of fire on cold nights, the voices of enslaved people who worked the family land and whose bondage underpinned his childhood comfort, though the full horror of it would be something he never questioned, never condemned. His father's stories of revolution and sacrifice filled the boy's mind with ideas of honor, loyalty, and states' rights, concepts that would shape him for life, binding his sense of identity to the notion that freedom meant a man's right to rule his own patch of land, no matter what. Jefferson's education was erratic at first. On the frontier, schools were few and books were precious. But his older brothers were determined that the youngest Davis would have more than they did. He was sent off to boarding schools, first to a Dominican boys' school in Kentucky, then to St. Thomas at Bardstown, where he was taught by Catholic monks despite being a Baptist by upbringing. It was at St. Thomas that young Jefferson learned Latin, classical history, and discipline. He was serious, watchful, a boy who listened more than he spoke, but who bristled if he felt slighted or disrespected. That sharp pride would stay with him all his life. Later, he attended Transylvania University in Lexington, one of the best schools west of the Appalachians. There, he rubbed shoulders with sons of wealthy planters and future political leaders. But Davis's path was not to be that of a lawyer or gentleman scholar. His family arranged for him to attend the United States Military Academy at West Point in 1824. At West Point, the raw boy from Mississippi stepped into a new world of rigid rules, stiff uniforms, and East Coast privilege. He was a competent student, but no star. He often chafed at authority, earning demerits for fighting and insubordination. But he also made friends who would one day stand on opposite sides of America's greatest conflict. One classmate, future Union General Joseph E. Johnston, would become both Davis's ally and bitter rival decades later. Another cadet, Robert E. Lee, would cross Davis's path again and again. A fellow Southerner bound by the same code of honor, but fated to carry a burden heavier than any West Point lesson plan could teach. In 1828, Jefferson Davis graduated 23rd in his class, a respectable but unremarkable standing. He wore the gray uniform of an officer now, but the boy who left the Kentucky log cabin was still there inside him, prideful, stubborn, and certain that his place in the world was to lead, not follow. In that restless young man, you can already see the seeds of the man he would become. A frontier child molded by war stories, raised in a world where liberty for some was built on chains for others, and convinced always that honor and loyalty were worth any cost. When Jefferson Davis strode out of West Point's stone gates in 1828, his future seemed cast in brass buttons and military drills. He was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the U.S. Army, assigned to frontier posts where America was pushing west, claiming land that belonged to native nations, building forts that pushed deeper into untamed lands. Young Davis found himself in places with names like Fort Crawford, where he served under a seasoned commander, Colonel Zachary Taylor, known as Old, Rough, and Ready. It was an ironic nickname, for Taylor's iron will would shape Jefferson's fate in ways no one foresaw. Life at a frontier post was harsh, lonely, and punctuated by skirmishes and disease. Davis, though stiff and formal to many, showed skill in commanding men. He learned how to navigate muddy politics between the army, local settlers, and tribal nations. He learned, too, that the army was a small world where reputation was gold and pride could turn to ruin. In 1835, pride turned to passion. Jefferson fell deeply in love with his commander's daughter, Sarah Knox Taylor. She was 18, spirited and well-educated, the bright center of Davis's restless heart. But Colonel Taylor, wary of the hardships faced by military wives, disapproved. Sarah and Jefferson defied him, marrying in June of that year. Their rebellion cost Davis his Army career. He resigned his commission to settle down as a planter in Mississippi, determined to build a life for his new bride away from the dangers of the frontier. It should have been a new beginning, but fate, as always, had its own script. Within 3 months of their marriage, both Jefferson and Sarah fell gravely ill, likely malaria, the frontier's unseen killer. Jefferson survived by a thread. Sarah did not. At 21, she died in his arms. Her father never forgave him, and Davis never forgave the world for taking her. Shattered, Jefferson withdrew to his inherited plantation on the Mississippi River, Briarfield, a stretch of fertile land that would become his refuge and his kingdom. There, he built his wealth the Southern way, fields of cotton tended by enslaved laborers whose names history rarely remembers. For nearly a decade, Davis lived as a widower, absorbed in managing his plantation, reading deeply in law and politics, and becoming a fixture of the Southern planter elite, men who measured status in acres and human bondage. In 1845, after years in mourning, he married again, this time to Verena Howell, the daughter of a prominent Mississippi family. She was 18 years his junior, smart, sharp-tongued, and quick-witted. Their letters reveal a marriage often tense, sometimes tender, built on deep affection, but strained by Jefferson's pride and the storms history would hurl at them. That same year, Davis stepped into the wider arena, elected to the U.S. House of Representatives as a Democrat. He soon proved himself no ordinary backbencher. His speeches were polished, his convictions fiery. He called for the annexation of more slave territory and the defense of Southern interests against the rising chorus of abolitionists in the North. When the Mexican-American War broke out in 1846, Davis left Washington behind. Always the soldier, he raised a volunteer regiment, the Mississippi Rifles, and went back to war. At the Battle of Buena Vista in 1847, Davis led his men in a desperate stand that helped win the day. He was shot in the foot, wounded for life, but hailed as a hero back home. Even his old father-in-law, Zachary Taylor, now his commanding general, praised his courage, if not the stubborn streak that always followed him. War made Davis a household name in the South. It opened doors back in Washington. He was appointed to the U.S. Senate in 1847, filling an unexpired term, and soon won a seat outright. There he spoke with the icy eloquence of a man certain he was right. He argued fiercely for states' rights, the idea that states should wield power equal to or above the federal government. He believed deeply in the South's right to expand slavery westward into new territories wrested from Mexico. By 1853, Davis's star rose higher still. President Franklin Pierce appointed him Secretary of War, a post he used to modernize the Army, strengthen coastal defenses, and send surveys west for a transcontinental railroad. He clashed with generals, pushed for new weapons, and worked tirelessly, earning a reputation as brilliant but inflexible. When Pierce's presidency ended, Davis returned to Mississippi, back to the Senate once more. He was now one of the South's loudest and clearest voices, seen by many as the champion who would defend slavery against the Northern tide. But for all his passion, there was a tragic edge to Davis's conviction. He could imagine no future where the South might adapt and survive without slavery. He saw any compromise as surrender. To him, the right of states to govern themselves, even if that meant enslaving millions, was sacred, inherited from his father's revolution, and never to be abandoned. By 1860, when Abraham Lincoln won the presidency on a wave of Northern anti-slavery sentiment, the Southern powder keg finally exploded. One by one, Southern states voted to secede, to tear away from the Union they had helped build. Davis, though not an eager radical, would follow Mississippi wherever it led. When his state left the Union in January 1861, he resigned from the Senate with tears in his eyes. He claimed he was not an enemy of the Union, but that loyalty to Mississippi and the South came before any flag in Washington. And so the soldier, planter, and politician, molded by grief, pride, and a conviction that the South could not live without chains, was about to be crowned the reluctant president of a rebellion that would rip the United States apart. By the winter of 1860, the stage was set for the storm. Years of uneasy compromises and fiery speeches in Congress had failed to resolve America's great contradiction. A nation founded on liberty, yet shackled by slavery. When Abraham Lincoln was elected president, with no Southern state voting for him, it confirmed the South's worst fears, that the tide had turned and the North would strangle the slave economy and Southern way of life. The idea that the federal government could limit slavery's spread or even abolish it outright sent shockwaves through the Cotton Kingdom. Jefferson Davis did not rush to call for secession like the hot-blooded fire-eaters who filled Southern taverns with talk of rebellion. He was a reluctant radical, no abolitionist by any means, but also not blind to the terrible cost of disunion. In those final days as a senator, he still believed that a final compromise might hold the fragile Union together. But Davis's loyalty to the idea of states' rights was absolute. When Mississippi voted to secede on January 9th, 1861, he knew there was no turning back. He delivered his farewell address to the Senate with calm dignity and tears that surprised even his enemies. He reminded his colleagues that he had served the Union faithfully as a soldier and statesman, but that his first allegiance was to his people, his state, and the system they depended upon. He returned to Briarfield a private citizen, but he would not stay one for long. The newly formed Confederate States of America needed a leader, someone respected, with military experience and political polish, a man who could rally Southern pride and present a respectable face to the watching world. On February 18, 1861, in Montgomery, Alabama, Jefferson Davis was sworn in as the provisional president of the Confederate States. He accepted the office not with cheers in his throat, but with what he called more of apprehension than hope. Even then, he understood the odds. The South had spirit and cotton, but the North had industry, manpower, and ships. War would be no grand adventure. It would be slaughter. Still, Davis believed the South was right, that secession was legal, and that the Founding Fathers' dream of states freely bound together included the right to leave that bond when it no longer served them. To him, the federal government's attempt to keep the Union whole by force was tyranny. The new Confederacy quickly gathered like-minded states: South Carolina, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. Later, after the first shots at Fort Sumter, Virginia, Arkansas, North Carolina, and Tennessee joined the rebellion. Davis faced an impossible task: building a new nation from scratch under blockade and invasion. He shaped a government modeled closely on the U.S. Constitution, but with explicit protections for slavery woven into its core. In his inaugural address, he painted the Confederacy not as an act of treason, but as a continuation of the American Revolution, a second rebellion to secure liberty, though his version of liberty rested on the bondage of millions. The break with the Union was more than political. It was deeply personal. Many of Davis's oldest friends and West Point classmates now wore Union blue. Generals and senators he'd once toasted with whiskey in Washington would soon face his armies on bloody fields from Virginia to Mississippi. He named a cabinet, raised armies, and picked commanders, none more important than Robert E. Lee, who would become the Confederacy's sharpest sword and Davis's greatest hope for victory. He commissioned new currency, secured foreign loans, and desperately sought diplomatic recognition from Britain and France. But the world was wary. Slavery was a stain that few European powers wanted to be openly linked to. The cause that bound Davis to his destiny was not some abstract principle. It was the South's bedrock: cotton, plantation wealth, and racial slavery. To Davis, it was not a moral failing, but a way of life worth defending at all costs. He could imagine no South without it, no future for his people without the unpaid labor of others. That truth would make compromise impossible and the war unavoidable. As Union and Confederate forces clashed in battles with names that would burn into history, Bull Run, Shiloh, Antietam, Jefferson Davis clung to his belief that the South could outlast the North's will to fight. He believed that battlefield valor, sheer stubbornness, and the South's conviction in its cause would wear down Northern resolve, just as the American colonies had once worn down the mighty British Empire. Yet for all his grand rhetoric about honor and freedom, the Confederacy Davis led was doomed by its own contradictions. Preaching liberty while shackling millions, claiming states' rights yet demanding unity from fiercely independent Southern governors, promising prosperity even as fields were burned, cities besieged, and families starved. Still, Davis pressed on. To him, losing was unthinkable, because losing meant not just the collapse of a new nation, but the end of the world he knew. The plantations, the social order, the old Southern aristocracy, all would vanish if the North triumphed. And so the break became a war, the costliest, bloodiest chapter in American history, with Jefferson Davis at its helm, a soldier turned politician turned rebel president, now locked in a struggle that would not only decide his fate, but the soul of the nation he once served and then tore in two. From the first thunder of cannon at Fort Sumter in April 1861, Jefferson Davis stepped fully into the role that would define and destroy him. President of the Confederate States of America, a nation born of rebellion, clinging to an idea already slipping through its fingers. It was a presidency with no guidebook, no tested cabinet, no steady supply lines, no unified loyalty beyond the shared cause of secession. From the start, Davis's desk was a battlefield in itself, stacked with petitions from desperate governors, urgent dispatches from front lines, foreign pleas for recognition, and always the gnawing dread that the South's fragile hope was already bleeding out in the red clay of Virginia. Davis's greatest strength was also his curse. He was tireless, detail-obsessed, convinced that he alone could steer the ship through the storm. While Abraham Lincoln learned to delegate, to let his generals fight, Davis could not let go of the reins. He meddled in strategy, quarreled with generals, and often promoted loyalty over competence. Even so, in those early months, the Confederate cause roared to life with an energy that startled the Union. Volunteers in gray surged to the front lines. In July 1861, at Bull Run, called Manassas in the South, Davis watched as Southern forces routed a larger Union army in a chaotic, thunderous victory that filled Richmond's streets with wild cheers. It looked, for a moment, as if the rebellion might truly stand. Davis moved the Confederate capital from Montgomery to Richmond, closer to the action, but also closer to the fire. He spent countless nights poring over maps by lamplight, scribbling notes to generals like Joseph E. Johnston and the rising star Robert E. Lee. He approved new armies, debated strategies for defending vast open territory with limited resources, and pushed for the South's dream of foreign aid. He believed, perhaps naively, that Britain and France, hungry for Southern cotton, would recognize the Confederacy and intervene against the Union blockade that was slowly strangling the South's trade. But the moral stain of slavery, already abolished in Britain and deeply unpopular among European common folk, made open recognition a dangerous gamble for any monarch. And so, the Confederacy's cotton remained trapped behind Union lines and ironclads, rotting in storehouses while Southern cities starved. Inside his cabinet, Davis's presidency was a boiling pot of tension. He clashed bitterly with his vice president, Alexander Stephens, who championed strong states' rights, even to the point of defying Davis's wartime policies. Governors resented Richmond's attempts to control their militias. In a Confederacy built on the idea of decentralized power, Davis found himself shackled by the very principle he claimed to defend. As the war dragged on, the Confederacy's early victories gave way to grim reality. Union forces, better equipped, better fed, and backed by factories and railroads the South lacked, pressed deeper into Confederate territory. Cities like Vicksburg fell, splitting the Confederacy along the Mississippi. Union General William Tecumseh Sherman burned a swath through Georgia and the Carolinas, leaving Southern farms in ashes. Meanwhile, Davis's rigid style of leadership turned friends into enemies. He feuded with General Joseph E. Johnston over defensive strategy in the West, replacing him more than once with generals who failed spectacularly. He clashed even with Robert E. Lee at times, though Lee, ever the loyal knight, served with more patience than most. As hardship spread, so did dissent. Ordinary Southern families, poor farmers with no stake in slavery, grew weary of dying for planters' fortunes. Food riots broke out in cities like Richmond, where desperate women stormed bakeries for bread. Confederate money became worthless, inflation devoured wages, and desertion crept through the gray ranks like a ghost in winter camps. Still, Davis pressed on, stubborn as the boy who had once bristled at West Point's rules. He made impassioned speeches, urged his people to hold the line, dreamed of last-ditch alliances and battlefield miracles. To him, the Confederacy was no temporary rebellion. It was his country, his charge, his destiny. Defeat was unthinkable, but by 1865, defeat was all that remained. Union armies closed like a vice around Richmond. Lee's lines crumbled at Petersburg. With the capital about to fall, Davis fled with his government by train. A bedraggled caravan of wagons, crates of Confederate archives, and the last flicker of a doomed dream. He tried to hold on, urging Lee to rally in North Carolina for one more stand, but Lee knew it was over. On April 9th, 1865, at Appomattox Courthouse, Robert E. Lee surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant. The Army of Northern Virginia was finished. The Confederacy was finished. Davis's presidency ended not with a treaty, but with him fleeing through pine forests in Georgia, hunted by Union cavalry. In May 1865, near Irwinville, Georgia, Davis was captured. Wrapped in his wife's shawl, trying to slip through the picket lines, he was taken prisoner. The once proud president of the Confederacy reduced to a man on the run, his country dissolved, his cause defeated. For 2 years, he languished in a damp prison cell at Fort Monroe, chained and humiliated, a ghost of the Southern pride he once embodied. Many Northerners wanted him tried for treason, hanged as the traitor who tore the Union apart. But politics shifted. A formal trial never came. In 1867, he was released on bail, never tried, never fully pardoned. A man without a country, yet still stubbornly loyal to the cause that had damned him. When he died in 1889, old and sick in New Orleans, Davis was mourned across the South as a martyr and reviled across the North as a symbol of treason and slavery's grip. In his last years, he urged Southern youth to embrace the Union again, but never once admitted that the cause itself had been wrong. To the end, he called slavery an institution protected by the Constitution. He died as he had lived, unyielding, proud, and forever the president of a nation that no longer existed. Why does a man who died in 1889, whose rebellion was buried beneath Appomattox's white flags and Sherman's ashes, still cast a long, cold shadow across America? Why, even now, do statues of Jefferson Davis stand or fall in town squares? Why do his speeches get dusted off by scholars and politicians alike? Why does his name still spark quarrels over flags that flutter over state houses and on license plates over who gets remembered as hero or villain? Jefferson Davis matters because his life is a warning and a window. A warning that the ideas he clung to, states' rights twisted to preserve human bondage, rebellion disguised as liberty, never really died when the Confederate flag was lowered. They slipped into memory and myth, rebranded as heritage by generations who wanted to remember a South of magnolias and gallantry, but not the whips, chains, and auctions that made that world possible. Davis is woven into the long, tangled roots of America's struggle with race. He did not invent slavery. He did not stand alone in defending it. But as the Confederacy's chosen leader, he gave its cause a polished, respectable face, a former U.S. Senator and War Secretary, not a wild-eyed rebel, but a man in fine tailoring, quoting the Founding Fathers. He embodied the tragic contradiction of a republic proclaiming freedom while shackling millions. He also represents a lesson in leadership's limits and its dangers. Davis was gifted, intelligent, driven, unwavering, but he was too rigid, too proud, too certain of his own righteousness to bend when bending might have spared his people ruin. He reminds us that stubbornness is not always courage, that conviction without question can become catastrophe. He matters because the ghosts of the Civil War still rattle America's doors. Monuments to Davis and his generals rose decades after the guns fell silent, not just to honor the dead, but to send a message to the living, to Black citizens who, even as freed men and women, found themselves shackled by segregation, terror, and laws designed to keep them second class. Every debate over whether a statue should stand or fall, every flag controversy, every classroom argument about how to teach the Civil War carries Jefferson Davis's fingerprints. He is there when we debate how to remember our failures, not just our triumphs. And yet he also reminds us that history does not bend to nostalgia. In the end, the cause he championed was defeated not only on the battlefield, but in the long moral reckoning that followed. The slow, bloody march through Reconstruction, Jim Crow, the Civil Rights Movement, and the work that continues today. To study Jefferson Davis is to study what happens when a nation tears itself apart, when compromise collapses, when people believe the worst fight is better than the hardest conversation. It is to study the cost of clinging to a past that should have been buried with the dead at Gettysburg and Antietam. If we know him, really know him, not the marble statue or the half-told legend, then maybe we guard against repeating him. Maybe we see how quickly freedom's banner can be twisted to bind others. Maybe we understand that remembering does not mean excusing, that facing the shadows does not mean we celebrate them. Jefferson Davis matters today not because he should be honored, but because forgetting him means forgetting what can happen when a nation divides over its own soul and what it costs to sew it back together, stitch by bloody stitch. So, my friends, tonight we have stood eye to eye with Jefferson Finis Davis, the frontier boy who rose to power, the soldier who traded the eagle for a new flag, the planter who would not bend, the president who watched his country burn. His story is not easy to sit with. It does not comfort us with triumph or easy heroes. It does not end in redemption. It asks us instead to look hard at what one man's iron pride and one region's desperate grasp on a dying institution did to an entire nation. It asks us to remember that the blood spilled for freedom did not wash away the memory of what came before. When Davis died in New Orleans in 1889, thousands lined the streets to see him buried. For decades after, children were taught to speak his name with pride in some parts of the South. Monuments rose, granite and marble cast in bronze, cold, unyielding reminders that history is written not just in books, but in what we choose to carve into our public squares. But stone weathers, flags fade, and memory shifts when we let truth do its work. In classrooms and courthouses and quiet conversations, we reckon with Davis's legacy still, the stubborn myth of a lost cause that tried to paint bondage as benevolence and treason as chivalry. We see that myth crumble stone by stone when we look at it without illusions. Tonight, we remember that it matters how we remember. We stand not to glorify, but to understand, because understanding is what keeps us from sleepwalking into old mistakes under new flags. Understanding teaches us to see the danger when the wrong ideas dress themselves up in the old language of freedom. Faces of History does not shy from shadows, because shadows teach us too. They teach us that leadership can destroy as easily as it can lift, that loyalty without question can become a poison, that the price of putting pride above people is paid in graves and widows and shattered homes. So tonight, as you sip what's left in your glass, as you blow out the candle or turn down the lamp, hold this truth close. Jefferson Davis is gone, but the world he shaped is not yet fully past. It is up to each of us to decide what we do with the echoes he left behind. May we stand braver than he did. May we build a union stronger than the one he broke. And may we keep telling these stories so that the next generation sees the whole of the past and chooses better than some who came before. I am the Duke of New York, and this has been Faces of History. Until next time, my friends, stay curious, stay brave, and keep walking the corridors of history with eyes wide open. Good night.